Early Voices for Civil Rights. Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey. With the ruling of separate but equal ringing in the heads of African Americans after 1896, different views emerged as to how they could achieve the true equality guaranteed to them in the 14th Amendment. Booker T. Washington believed that it would take time and experience. W.E.B. Du Bois believed that it would take the court system, and Marcus Garvey advocated for separation. Booker T. Washington was born in 1856, 9 years before the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, and was, therefore, born a slave. Realizing that education was the key to success, Washington attempted Hampton Institute at the age of 16 and learned the importance of having skills and a trade. Every student on the campus of Hampton was required to have a job while on campus, with Washington's being a janitor. This experience would greatly influence his views on how African Americans would eventually gain the respect of whites and therefore true equality. At the age of 25, Washington was asked to lead Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He carried his experience at Hampton with him, believing that all of his students should learn craft and industrial skills. If African Americans learned these skills well and became needed in society because of these skills, they would eventually be seen as equals by whites. Therefore, Washington advocated for African Americans to delay demanding their equal rights and to work to gain economic security with industrial and farming skills. They would have to accept segregation and discrimination until their wealth would win the respect and admiration of whites. In 1895, Washington delivered the Atlanta Exposition speech before a mostly white audience in Atlanta, Georgia. The speech opened with Washington suggesting that it was a mistake for African Americans to want political equality when what they should have been doing was opening up a dairy farm or a garden. In 1901, Washington published his autobiography, Up from Slavery, in which he continued to outline his plans for success for African Americans. He spent pages in his book talking about the importance of not only learning a trade, but also of proper manners and hygiene if African Americans were ever going to be accepted by whites. Washington's views were seen as surrendering to whites by many African Americans, including W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was born in Western Massachusetts in 1868, 3 years after slavery had been ended by the 13th Amendment. He went on to earn a degree at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, one of the schools established by the Freedmen's Bureau to educate the newly freed slaves. In 1895, he became the first African American to earn a Ph.D. at Harvard University. Just as Washington's views were influenced by his childhood in slavery and in the post-Civil War South and educational experience, Du Bois, never having been a slave, growing up in Massachusetts, and having been educated in some of the better schools in the country, showed him the value of having equal rights immediately. Du Bois wanted to believe that whites would end segregation based on social science, but soon realized that only agitation and the legal process would bring about the equality that African Americans were guaranteed by the Constitution. Du Bois challenged Washington's ideas, calling his 1895 speech the Atlanta Compromise, and argued in his book, The Souls of Black Folks, that Washington's views were only going to force African Americans to be seen as second-class citizens. He believed that the top 10%, or the talented tenth, of African Americans should be further educated to improve their leadership abilities and help African Americans reach equal status. In 1905, he began the Niagara Movement, which advocated for African American civil rights. Forced to hold their meetings in Canada, because nowhere in the United States would allow them to meet as a group, the group accomplished very little. But his work did lead to the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which became a legal advocacy group for African American rights and continues to do the same to this day. While Washington and Du Bois were advocating for African Americans to work inside the system, Marcus Garvey was advocating for a return of African Americans to their ancestral homeland of Africa. Born in Jamaica in 1887 as the youngest of 11 children, Garvey became a printer's apprentice at 14 and led a strike for higher wages. From Jamaica in 1914, he began the United Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. He moved to Harlem in New York City 2 years later and found a willing audience for his program of returning to Africa. He believed that African Americans would never achieve equality in the United States and, therefore, needed to return to Africa, where they could be in charge of the government and society. In 1919, he formed the Black Star Line, whose purpose was to transport African Americans back to Africa, in addition to the Negro Factories Corporation to encourage economic independence for African Americans. He also tried to convince the government of Liberia, a country established by abolitionists in the United States in the 1820s to return slaves to Africa, to grant land to African Americans so that they could settle there, but was not successful in his efforts. By 1922, Garvey was accused of mail fraud in his running of the Black Star Line, and although the accusations were probably racially motivated, Garvey was eventually deported back to Jamaica and his movement fell apart. Each of these early voices represented a different viewpoint as to how African Americans could achieve equality in the years after the Plessy v. Ferguson case's ruling of separate but equal. They would be the voices that would echo down to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s and guide those leaders in making decisions about the best course of action to take to help African Americans gain their civil rights and true equality.